Oh, they really, it was so much fun being just down even in the same building. Looking forward to it. Thank you for coming.
I can move over. You're right there. I just moved over because you talk to here. So where's your president? She's in Tennessee. She loves to go to so far, the only direction is just your operation continues. And I'm going. I see her teaching us Walker Peters. Who knows? I wonder if we'll get there. I don't know. It's not the direction. Okay. Yeah, I think okay, why don't we start?
Well, good evening, brothers and sisters. It's wonderful to be with you this evening. This is going to be a great discussion tonight. Just even the past few minutes of sitting up here, I am really excited to be here because it's going to be great. My name is Chris Welch. I'm the Stake Sunday School president, and tonight we have just a wonderful discussion that is going to be led by Brother Jeff Walker. We would like to thank a few people that have helped make tonight possible, including Brother Hillstead for helping communicate this to our ward and stake and even other stakes, to Brother Scott Jones, who's making sure that the broadcast happens tonight. So thank you, Brother Jones, and for our wonderful stake presidency for their inspiration and leadership, and to be able to hold discussions like this tonight. Tonight, to begin, we've asked Sister Larson to give an opening prayer. Following that invocation, President Clark will be introducing our speaker, Brother Jeff Walker. And at the conclusion of tonight's discussion, we've asked Brother Larson to say a closing prayer. Again, thank you very much for coming and for attending in person and online. We look forward to tonight. So, Sister Larson.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we are so very grateful for the opportunity that we have to be here and participate in this amazing fireside this evening, whether it's here in person or via Zoom technology that you have blessed us with. We are so very thankful to have Brother Walker with us to this evening and to learn more about our beloved church history that he is so expert in. Thank you so much for our dear early church leaders and also for our dear early church pioneers and the legacy that they have left to us. Please allow thy Spirit to attend us this evening. And we ask these things in the name of our beloved Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
I got a tickle in my throat just as we started, so I apologize if I cough. I'm okay, but just, brothers and sisters, it's such a pleasure to see so many of you here tonight, and we appreciate those that are participating by Zoom tonight, and are grateful for all of you. As you know, we have been really thrilled to celebrate the anniversary of the restoration, the beginning of the restoration, with a series of wonderful speakers, and tonight is a continuation of that. I want to tell you about Jeff Walker. He may be one of the most talented people that you have not heard much about. He doesn't ask for a lot of recognition, but he's very deserving of recognition. Jeff is one of those rare people who is talented in so many areas and contributed in so many ways that it's difficult to really touch on them. He was an excellent student, ended up going to law school and being very successful in the practice of law, and also, though, had a great love for church history. And so he's had this sort of dual career of being a person who is a superb academic, an excellent lawyer. He writes very, very well. He's a delightful speaker. You're going to enjoy him tonight. He has, excuse me. Thank you, I'm already using one. Jeff has taught at the law school at BYU. He's taught religion classes. He's been one of the editors of the Joseph Smith Papers. In particular, he's had a special interest and love for the role that Oliver Cowdery played. And those of you who have read a lot about the three witnesses know that the church's most accomplished expert on the three witnesses is a BYU religion professor named Richard Anderson. He sort of wrote the book, so to speak, on the three witnesses. And sadly, Brother Anderson, in his age, was just unable to complete all of the publications that he had worked on and was preparing for before he passed away. Well, he recognized that the person who he wanted to complete that project was Jeff Walker. And so Jeff was entrusted with massive volumes of information relating to Oliver Cowdery, and is truly currently the most knowledgeable person, absolutely, in the church on this subject. I'm so grateful for him. He's been a friend of mine for many years. He's contributed so much by way of church history things. Among other things, he serves as a board member and treasurer of the Ensign Peak Foundation, which has also been known as the Mormon Historic Sites Foundation, that did the projects at Ensign Peak and much of the restoration at Kirtland and many other projects around the country. He's just a great contributor, wonderful man. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Jeff. Now, the rest of us are going to come sit down so we can see the slides. But Brother Larson, when it's time, if you'll come say the closing prayer. Anybody that needs to leave, if you've got kids to put to bed or whatever, feel free to leave after the closing prayer. If you'd like to be part of questions and answers, after the closing prayer, Jeff will stand back up and we'll do Q&A then. Does that make sense? So, okay, with that, Brother Walker, thank you.
Well, most of that's not deserved. I've loved your president for a long time and have a great deal of respect for him. And I'm honored to be invited to participate a bit today. I've thought about what we might talk about today, and I don't want to disappoint too many of you all. I guess we should just talk about, him being excommunicated, because that's kind of, that's pretty sexy and all. But, the sad truth about Oliver is he had no progeny. He had 6 children. The only one that grew to adulthood was his oldest daughter, born in 1835 in Kirtland. His next daughter, born in 1836, lived for just 6 months. His next 4 children, he lost all of them too. And his oldest daughter married a doctor, and they had no children. And so my thinking has been, as I've thought about tonight, if I was his great-great-great-grandson, would I want this fireside to be about my great-great-grandfather's excommunication? Maybe not. Maybe what I'd like to talk about is him coming back. Because at the end of the day, that's what the gospel is about. Because all of us stray, and the big question is how many of us are willing to humble ourselves enough to fully come back. And we all know that happens in all of our families. I'm going to go through some information that most of you might know, but maybe we'll have some common ground of some new things. He was born in 1806 on October 3rd. When Joseph Smith's 200th birthday was announced, and we started deciding as a church what we were going to do, we pulled out all the stops. I mean, we had musicals, we had operas, we had readings, we had symposiums, So you can imagine when we went up to the church and said, most of these founding fathers, they're all about the same age. They're going to start clicking on. So the next one is Oliver. What are we going to do in 2006 for Oliver? And the church said, we're a little exhausted. Brother Walker, I wish you would just leave things alone and let us run things. In the end, what they said is figure out something. And so we started a process. But we're not in charge of all things. And those that are in charge up above seems to have more things in mind. And one thing that happened was that we had this one image of Oliver. This is what Oliver looks like. We're pretty sure it is. In 1883, Julie F. Wells, in anticipation of putting out a special edition to the Contributor, which was the forerunner of the Ensign magazine, he wanted to do a recognition of the 3 witnesses. And for that, he wanted to get images of each of those witnesses. Now, it was pretty easy to get one of Martin Harris, that one where he looks mad and unhappy, and he probably was mad and unhappy doing a lot of that. Those pictures were taken. And then, of course, it was pretty easy to get one of David Whitmer. He lived the longest. He had the most recognition. He had probably the most pictures taken of him. But when it came down to getting an image of Oliver Cowdery, he really was in a pickle. And they looked long and hard to try to find an image of him. And then there was a rumor that his daughter, who was then living with her husband, doctor, in Richmond, Missouri, had a daguerreotype, which, as you know, is just one of these little tiny images that they did reversed on glass plate in her home. And she also had an oil painting, apparently, done of this daguerreotype. But at the time, the Whitmers and the Cowderys were no longer affiliated with the church, and there was a lot of pushback about whether us Utah Mormons should have any access to it. Matter of fact, Joseph F. Smith, who was second counselor in the first presidency, wrote 5 letters to Miss Johnson, Oliver's only surviving daughter, asking permission. And finally, she relented. and allowed a missionary, a guy named Hart, who was coming through Missouri, to stop by and pick up the daguerreotype and take it to New York City, where he took it to what was known in those days, the finest engraver in the country, Hall and Sons in New York City, to do an etching. Now, the problem with etchings, of course, is that you lose part of exactly what you get out of a daguerreotype, or maybe even an oil painting from an original. But the Hall and Sons did most of the famous etchings that you will see of early saints and of early places. Brigham Young loved them. Most Brigham Young was done. Heber C. Kimball was done. Willard Richards was done. The etchings of Oliver, of Hiram and Joseph Smith, of the Carthage jail, of the Smith home in Palmyra, those are all Hall and Sons etchings. And so we've had this etching for a long time. Now, over time, you'll see it different ways. Sometimes you see it reversed. Basically, people start painting it here out in Utah. Clausen, who was a relative of Young, he started doing paintings of it. And so you keep getting more and more distant of exactly what Oliver would look for. But this is who we had. And then, as if the heavens opened, there's this great institute teacher out of Wyoming named Patrick Bishop. Now, he was doing his master's degree in looking for early Mormon images out of the Library of Congress's big, huge library of images. And he was going through 1840s images and found an image that he thought might be Oliver. And this is what that image was. Now, it's tricky to always know, right? It's tricky to know because if you just want to draw lines like we all try to do to say, do the eyes line up? Does the nose line up? Do the ears line up? Well, let's be honest. All of our eyes and ears and mouths line up pretty well because there's a kind of, I guess, a geometry of faces, and that's how it all pretty much works. And so while we thought we were getting there, this was going to be more tricky than we thought because we were going to deal with one that was a 3/4 view of Oliver versus a straight-on image of Oliver. So we got involved at that point in time because all of a sudden we thought, well, possibly for the 200th birthday of Oliver Cowdery, might we have found a new image of what he actually looked like. And so we engaged 2 experts. Now, they're experts who, this is all they do. We had a group out of Vancouver, Canada, and had a group out of North Carolina. For example, there's a lot of Lincoln images that are still coming out. Are we good, guys? Oh, should I slide this way? Okay. Oh, we can't do that yet because I'm telling my story. And so we had 2 groups look at it. Because the last thing you want to do is say you got a new image and it's actually not a new image because that's like, bad history. Still cool, just not that right. Well, the first group said, out of all the images we can compare when we're comparing these 2, these are the most similar, which didn't give us a lot. I mean, we said, give us a number, like 85% sure, 90% sure. They said, well, we think you're maybe 90% in the game. And so we sent it to a second group, the group out of Vancouver. And they said, well, how we do it is a little different technology is we have over 7,000 images of men during this period of time. And we dump in these 2 images. And through our logarithms, then we can determine who are the closest matches. And of all those 7,000, which 2 do you think they said? They concluded to us, these are either the same person or twin brothers. We had found Oliver. Now, as a foundation, we then thought, what should we do with this image? And we thought, well, we should get a painting done. And there was some debate on the board about who should do the painting, because it'd be a pretty important painting for the church, be a pretty important painting for us. And I had my pick. I had a guy named Ken Corbett. I don't know if you know Ken, a fabulous painter. He used to be a fireman of all things. He's a savant on it. And so I gave him materials and I showed him the daguerreotypes and I said, listen, it's not been awarded to you yet. No one's been awarded. And, it's at the board, and boards are boards. And, I'm advocating for you, but, well, about 3 weeks later, he comes to my office and says, can I show you something? And oddly enough, he brought his wife with him, which is always telling. And he brought this painting of Oliver. And he said, I painted him. And I said, well, Ken, we've not let this contract out. I know. It's okay if I don't get it. And it's okay if you don't want to pay me. The Spirit woke me in the night and said, paint Oliver. And so I started that night. And his wife said to me, he walked the floors of our home until the painting was finished. Well, it's a pretty good sell to the board. Well, we thought we were done. But then Richard Anderson's wife, Rob, do you remember her name is? I'm just spacing her. I know her so well. She's a beautiful woman too. And red hair, I guess it's still red. It stayed red forever. My wife once asked me, do I know what color her original hair color is? And I'm like, at this point, hon, I don't know. So I don't know if her hair has always been red or not. But she is an expert in clothing, an expert in paintings, and she an expert for the church for a lot of years. And she said, well, the painting's interesting. We believe it's Oliver, but you have it wrong. And we said, how do we have it wrong? She said, well, he's not wearing a black suit. I said, well, it's a daguerreotype. Well, actually, she wrote me the longest email I've ever received. I printed it out. It was 26 pages long. And it had more typos than pages. And it was almost like this rambling, brilliant examination. And she had a whole bunch of things that she wanted us to change. Luckily, we deal with oil. We said, let's make it right. And so, in fact, it got concluded that he was actually wearing a brown suit. Now, there's a couple things that help us understand of whether this is the right daguerreotype. First of all, we've had this analysis. The second thing we know where this daguerreotype came from, where the first daguerreotype, see, because the 3/4 one, within 2 years after it being etched, their home burned in Richmond, Missouri, and burned the daguerreotype and the oil painting. So all we had was the etchings now. So this would be the first actual image that would have Oliver. And we knew a couple of things. We knew that the person that took this daguerreotype was from Cincinnati, Ohio. He was shooting his daguerreotype. He was a black daguerreotype named Ball. He was shooting him in 1845 to 1850 in Cincinnati. We know that Oliver at that point in time was living in Tiffin, Ohio. He was a lawyer there. And that we know that he was active in politics, a very active Democrat, and that he would have gone to Cincinnati, to most of the major cities around in that area, and that he was probably a known political figure for his day. And so it would have been very common for someone like Paul trying to get his start to take a picture like this. We know also the clothing that he's wearing is exactly, I didn't know this, but we now know that his clothing he's wearing is classic mid-1840s clothing. Close cut sleeves, a very tailored jacket, a same colored vest by the 1850s, and they're now wearing brocade vests, a different tie on the shirt, a high collar with a tie that would hold that collar up. He also mentioned a couple other things I want you to look at for a second on this. Now, of course, you probably picked out the one thing I did add to the painting. I mentioned to Ken that it might be cool if underneath his elbow, he was leaning on a first edition Book of Mormon. Now, had that been in the original daguerreotype, probably the mystery would have been more easily solved. But the truth is that Oliver never got away from the Book of Mormon. He was always connected to it, both his times inside the church and his time outside the church. He was always part of who he was, and he never shied away from understanding his role. He once wrote a letter to Phineas Young, Brigham Young's brother, and he was talking about the church, and he said to him, I know what's best for her. Speaking of the church, for I am her oldest member. And remember, he knew that, because if you remember in the Susquehanna, Joseph first baptized Oliver, and then Oliver baptized Joseph. He knew he stood at a singular, pivotal place in the Restoration. So I believe this is what Oliver looked like. Small, short, 5'6", maybe 120 pounds. It was kind of like Mutt and Jeff against big Joseph Smith, big barrel-chested, 6'1.5", about this tall as Joseph was, burly guy, and his best buddy was this little tiny guy. Maybe I can identify a little with that too. Yes, Carmen Anderson. And she was right. She made the painting better. Oh, I want to say one other thing about the painting. So clearly the Book of Mormon's mine. But there was another little problem we had that we're trying to sort out, and that is that he's holding something in his hand. She found that he did have he had a little pin in his shirt, a stick pin with a little pearl top on it we put in, and then he's holding something. It has a straight bevel. We looked hard to try to find out what that could possibly be. We first thought maybe it was glasses, that maybe he had glasses in a lanyard. And we did every checking we could, check everyone we found. We could find no place that he was ever wearing glasses of any sort. Then we thought, well, maybe he's holding a watch. Maybe it could be a watch. And so then we started looking at all watches in the 1830s, 1840s to say, is there anyone that have that square bezel across the top? We could find nothing to match that. What do you think that is in his hand? You want to tell you what I think it is? I think he's holding a cross. See, if this picture was taken to him in the 1840s, he was a period of time when he was outside the church, living in Tiffin, working as an attorney. But he was always a religious man. And the concept of crosses, while it's not part of our vocabulary today in the church, we have used crosses as a remembrance of our Savior for many, many years. And while we have somewhat distinguished ourselves with our Moroni's on our temples, and which is a beautiful symbol of the Restoration, certainly a cross wouldn't offend any of us if that's what he was clutching in his hand. Well, you have to wonder exactly how did Oliver totally become fully engaged in this work? If you remember the story, he was hired as a substitute school teacher in Manchester. He replaced his brother Warren, who had the contract. Interestingly enough, Warren was 18 years older than him. He was the baby brother. There were 8 children in his family, and he was the baby. His mother died when he was 3 years old, and his dad remarried, and they would have 3. So he has 3 step sisters. One of them married Phineas Young, and that's why Phineas Young became friendly with Oliver while Oliver was out of the church, because he was his brother-in-law. And so there's always been a question about what made him so committed. Was it the stories that Joseph Sr. told? And what drove him to go to Harmony and to meet the prophet Joseph? He would write that he was fully committed at that point. We know likely that the farm that Joseph bought from his father-in-law, the 13.5 acres, the down payment was likely paid for by the money that Oliver brought as a school teacher, because he got paid at the end of the term and he's the only one that had any cash. So what would make you be that invested? Now, the only thing we historically have found was one little a couple verses in section 6 of the Doctrine and Covenants that's addressed to Oliver that clearly Oliver is asking, what more is there for me? Because most of us ask those questions. And the Lord said, remember the night you prayed to me, and I spoke peace to your soul. Do you need a greater witness than that? And so that's kind of what we've all held on to, right? That small voice that most of us will hear. Would that be enough? Well, when we talk about the Joseph Smith Papers, and one of the reasons why it's such an important project is it allows us to look at things anew. And when we did find some new information on this. In the histories, which is, well, the histories volumes of the Joseph Smith Papers are a group of different histories written. Joseph wrote very few of them. He wrote very few in his own pen. He dictated some, others wrote others, and this is what we'd call Joseph Smith's first effort to write a history in his own words. It's the most original to hear Joseph's voice. Anytime you use a scribe, you just have a tendency they seem to make us look smarter. It's like I tell people, I don't write anything without an editor, because editors make you look smart. And scribes helped the early church look a little more smooth in how they're writing. But in the Histories one, Joseph mentions Oliver, and he says, when Lord appeared unto a young man by the name of Oliver Cowdery. Now, have any of you ever heard this before? And showed unto him the plates in a vision, and also the truth of the work and what the Lord is about to do through me, his unworthy servant. Therefore, he was desirous to come and write for me. Well, all of a sudden, it becomes pretty understandable while he would be very anxious to not go back home and see his family, to not go see the Whitmers or David, his buddy, but head right to Harmony when he finished his tenure. And that's what the magic of the papers are, is they help give us more access to the original source material, so that more of us can see that the picture, where it gets confusing, where we don't understand it, most of the time it's because we just don't have all the pieces of it. So clearly, if there was indeed a vision, and the Lord told him the truthfulness of the work, one might be readily engaged. Yes, sir.
There's precedence for this. I'm thinking of how you live and how you receive knowledge.
Well, and certainly, and that's a good point to make, because Oliver, you think about it, if you're writing the entire Book of Mormon out, how well do you think you know the book? Now, part of me thought maybe he was just zoning out and he was just writing words. But as we're going to talk, he became almost one of the great first experts of understanding the Book of Mormon, the story, what the stories were about. And I bet he identified that. He'd say, that's exactly what happened to me. The Lord does work the same way. And the Lord actually did. Working with him as a scribe, certainly we know that he wrote basically with his own hand the entire book. He wasn't the only scribe, but he was so particular that he would often rewrite other people's transcriptions in his own hand into the scribing. And why? Because he has beautiful penmanship. And it is an elegant hand. And now it took only about 60, Jack Welch could have told you this better. I don't know if he spoke on that when he spoke to you all, about how fast the transcription process went by. And he's done such an incredible job of helping us understand just what was done when. Of what days even we can figure what was being done then. About 60 days of transcription work to transcribe the entire Book of Mormon. To make the copy, the printer's copy, of course, after losing the first group of 116 pages, it's always hard to know if it's exactly, was it 116 pages of manuscript we lost, or 116 pages of the book did we lose, but we lost, we call it 116 pages. So whatever that we've lost, we know we lost the book of Lehi, right? We know we lost the first chapters in the book of Mosiah, meaning we lost King Mosiah's lectures, and we start off right with King Benjamin. And if it would have been King Benjamin, it would be called probably the book of Benjamin, because that's how they named the books. But we know that after loss of those, there was a great paranoia about losing track of any of the original. And so a duplicate copy was made, and that's what we call the printer's manuscript of the original. If you remember, it was kept, Emma carried it across in her dress across Missouri for us. She was very attached to it. No, I just thought of that, and I wish I hadn't said it, but I thought it was, and so she kept it. And after the death of the prophet, she kept it, and she remarried, and it ends up it got put into the cornerstones of what would have been the Nauvoo house. And once that flooded and they were reconstructing it, her husband found that it had been waterlogged, dried out the best he could, and he started giving away pages to visitors and missionaries and people that would come who would like souvenirs. Today, we have gathered about 25% of that book. Much of it is in very, very difficult. We're just getting ready, so you should know we're within the next 6 months to a year, we'll have the printer's manuscript has been published in the Joe Smith papers. That is out. Those are the large scale ones, the ones that if it could come with a hand cart should, because they're pretty hefty books. Skousen, who has been working with us on that project, with the agreement that we'd do the original manuscript, which was going to be a much more difficult, both to re-image, to try to make sure we get as much of the imaging out of it. And that's just getting to be put in publication. I think it'll come out in late 2022. But it took 6 months to make a second copy. That's how much harder it was. And that's why there were so many changes between the original version and the 1835 version, because when you're making these copies, just some of these errors are going to creep in. And so having a good editor relook at it all is one of the parts that Oliver was, undoubtedly it's why he was put in charge of it, right? He was sent with Hiram. Who could Joseph trust more than Hiram and Oliver to run it? Well, we know that they were there. Oliver shared most of the seminal moments of the restoration. They're first known as the elders, and we now refer to them as the first and the second elders, with Joseph taking the position as the first elder. I'm confident Oliver would have no argument about that. But they were there together with John the Baptist, maybe the most important person coming, because if you remember, the reason that Joseph even went to the grove itself was looking for remission of his sins, right? And who was the person that was going to facilitate that process? I don't think he even had in his mind's eye what it might all look like, even what Peter and James and John would be doing. But he understood clearly what John the Baptist, that's why we know so much about that, right? In section 15, the Doctrine and Covenants, we know the date, we know when it happened, we know close to where it happened. Now, if we go back to Harmony, we actually know that it didn't happen at the river, right? It didn't happen at the river. The river was like a highway, 300 to 500 boats a day going by. It'd be a little awkward. There'd be a few more witnesses, right? There'd be like hundreds of witnesses saying, hey, we're going by the old Smith place. Yeah. Did you see there was angels there today? Yeah, that's pretty cool. And we know that really it was up. Joseph loved woods. He loved sugar groves. And he had, on his 13-acre property, he had the north end of the property was a sugar grove. And so we know that that's where those events likely happened with John the Baptist. We know that the culmination of it would happen at the Kirtland Temple. In that Sunday following the dedication, when they dropped the curtains, the veils of the temple around the podiums, that we had not only our Savior come, but we had Elias come. I've stood in the Holy Lands. When I first got called to be on the papers, Marlon Jensen said to me, you need to go to the Holy Lands. I'm like, why? I'm doing church history. He says, no, you need to go. So sure enough, my wife and I went. It was an unbelievable experience. Wonderful places to know where the Savior walked. But you know, the one thing that kind of troubled me a little bit, it's hard. You don't really ever know exactly where he walked. I mean, you go to the Jordan River, it's a river. And you say, like, do you know where? And they say, well, someplace here. And, you know, they got different places where they think it could be. But see, the sacred spots of the Restoration are different. Maybe President Clark was with us on a trip to Kirtland. We got to be locked in the Kirtland Temple. Locke Mackay, who's one of the Community of Christ apostles now, he was over church history for them. And his mother-in-law actually at the time was his bishop. And they had their congregation right across the street from the temple. And he said to us one day, there's a group of us out there working on the Kirtland Flats area. He said, if I lock you in the temple for an hour or so while we have our meetings, you're going to break anything, are you? And we're like, no. I will tell you, my friends, I had my brother with me. He had left the church at the time. We're not codependent, but I talk to him every day of my life. The only time we've ever been apart is on our missions. And I brought him with me because he's an architect. That was my ruse. And he was there in the temple with us that day. I think there were 7 or 8 of us. And we wandered around. And we went up into these pulpits. We took our shoes off, if you remember, President. And we tried to imagine in our mind's eye whether Jesus stood on the pulpit. Joseph and Oliver on the middle pulpits. That's where they sat as the first presidency. Their father, Joseph Sr., sat behind him. We know that for sure because during one of the dedicatory services, Peter came through that back with that window, right? And Joseph looks down and sees sandals, looks up, says, oh, Peter's here. So we wondered in that day whether when the Savior came, if he stood on the pulpit right above them, or if they were turned around. But you know, we were within feet, just a few feet of knowing exactly the exact spot where the Savior had stood. It's a special, unique experience to be in sacred places where you know things like that actually happened. We had a testimony meeting, you probably remember, because you have to. And you 6, 8 guys. It doesn't end until everyone bears their testimony. My brother was the last one. I was nervous. I didn't want him to feel uncomfortable. But I knew he felt what we all were feeling. And he got up, finally, and he said, would it be all right, friends, rather than bear my testimony if I sang a song? He has a beautiful tenor voice. He sang Joseph Surf's prayer. You might agree, President, it might have been the best testimony of the group. Well, we watched a movie on the way back home, sharing a headphones. So it was a little weird looking 2 guys, heads together, watching a movie together. He put his hand on my knee and said to me, you know I have to come back, don't you? I said, I know, because it all happened. Well, all of it was there when it actually did happen. You know, he was involved in a lot of writings for the church. He involved in writing early documents. Before we got Section 20 of the Doctrine and Covenants, he wrote what we call the Articles of the Church of Christ. Beautiful expose, taking most of it from the Book of Mormon, direct quotes, looking how the church was going to be organized, how it was going to be laid out, how the prayers were going to work, how the church organization was going to be done. He understood it. He helped guide it. Section 20 has his imprint in it. When the Lord decided he had to give it, I could see the Lord saying, hey, Joseph, just take a look at what Oliver did because it's pretty good work. I got some cleanup stuff to do to make sure it can become scripture, but he did a pretty good work for us. Well, as you might guess, I've loved looking at his life as a lawyer. He was certainly the first, what I call the first Mormon lawyer, for good or bad. He was involved in a lot of things. You know, when I first got involved in this church history work, my wife thought I was crazy. She's like, I thought we planned you being a lawyer, and I'd be the lawyer's wife, not the, what are you? Because it went from an interest to a hobby, to a passion, to an obsession, to changing almost everything in my life. And I always wondered how she was managing it, because I saw our bank accounts change. Because church work is not the most, well, I've never taken a penny for it, so I guess that would be part of my problem. I have not negotiated my deals quite as I should. But she bought me this note for Christmas one year. I knew it was true love. Because during a period of time when they were trying to figure out how to make the Kirtland Safety Society work, they were a tough time getting a charter. In those days, you had to get a charter from the government, from the state, to have a corporation. You had to get a charter to run a bank. And they were running into significant roadblocks of getting that charter, so they were looking at alternative methods to run a legally authorized banking institution, which would be known as the Kirtland Safety Society, without a formal charter. One way that they thought of doing it, and they ended up with multiple routes, but one way they thought about is, what if we acquired a controlling interest in an out-of-state bank, and we just made Kirtland Safety Society be a branch office, a branch of that out-of-state bank. And so they did. They bought a controlling interest in the closest, one of the oldest banks in Michigan, called the Bank in Monroe. They bought a controlling interest. Ironically, they bought it with Kirtland Safety Society notes predominantly. So that was a really good strategic financial deal for the sellers. Oliver then resigned from all of his positions in the church at the time, all of his financial positions and responsibilities, and he moved to Monroe, Michigan. And for a short period of time, he became the vice president of the Bank in Monroe. And they issued a very few set of notes, bank notes. And it just so happens, the reason why I always would want a Bank of Monroe, they're not super valuable, I would guess. And they're not as valuable as an original Kirtland Safety Society note, which she also got me one a couple years later, because she saw how, I cried like a little young boy when I got it. But, and the reason why this one was so awesome, not just that it was a Bank of Monroe note, but whose signature is on the note? Do you all see it, huh? Right? Matter of fact, I tried to remember to bring it because, but we just moved. And so finding it is more tricky because it is really someplace apparently really safe. But he then early on had interest. He became the Justice of the Peace for the Kirtland Safety Society. For the Justice of the Peace in Kirtland. He won by a landslide, 602 votes to 2 votes. The only other votes against him was the person running against him and the person running against him's brother. He did win almost a unanimous selection of being. He was only Justice of the Peace for 3 months. It was a hard thing for him because America is a very litigious world. Imagine in those 3 months, he had over 240 lawsuits that he heard. Now, the majority of them were collection cases because that's what most people want to use lawyers for, is because someone owes you money. But he had some other ones that were relatively important. I'm just going to mention this one. It was his very last one. I wonder if it was the one that he kind of said, I'm out. Because Joseph and Sidney have gone on a mission they were going up to Palmyra, and then they're going up to Canada. So they're out of town. Kirtland Safety Society has now failed. Joseph has given notice of it to be closed. Warren Parrish, who's one of the officers of the bank is still issuing notes. He is trying to redeem it. He's thinking, well, who knows exactly what Warren Parrish is thinking. I think he was embezzling. I think the best evidence is he embezzled upwards of $40,000 of 1840 money. And so they were trying to get a warrant issued to search Warren Parrish's home, thinking because what happened is these notes would be printed in mass quantities, but then they wouldn't be signed. And it looked like Warren was signing them and reissuing notes out. And so they're trying to have a warrant issued. And the second justice of the peace at the time, not that Mormons were controlling Geauga County, but by this point, Frederick G. Williams was the second justice of the peace. But he was a bit crosswise with the church based on the Kirtland Safety Society, and he refused to issue a warrant against Warren Parrish. And so there's a meeting that is then held in the Kirtland Temple. And in part of the meeting, Joseph Sr. is at the podium, and he raises this issue that Warren Parrish should stop doing any misdeeds that we all believe he is engaged in. And at that point in time, a ruckus emerges, and some of the men, including Warren Parrish and Boynton, some of the others, try to rush the podium to try to get their time. And they knock Sr. over. And the last thing you want to do is knock Joseph Smith Sr. over when all of his sons are there, because not all of his sons were as good-natured as Hiram. There's plenty of history of the sons being a bit of a hothead, which Joseph might have been too. I mean, Joseph, you got to think about it. Joseph was a young guy. He was a young A-type man. We never got to see Joseph mellowed. If you were going to judge me how I was in my early 30s, I'm a much nicer person these days. Just ask my sweetheart. Because I've had time to see that not everything goes as I want, and that I have to be okay with it. And so in this world, they actually carried a bunch of the rabble-rousers out of the temple. But it created quite a mess. They had stoves in the temple trying to keep it warm. They knocked over the stovepipes. It filled the temple with smoke. It was a mess. And so immediately the people that were carried out went and filed a complaint for assault and battery and riot against Joseph Smith Sr., his sons, other church leaders. And this all fell to Oliver Cowdery to hear. Now, Oliver Cowdery, everything I can tell, he's one kind-hearted man. And this case was brutal on him. It had 48 witnesses. It was so booked that they held it in another person's church to find something large enough scale that they could actually hold the trial in. The trial went on for 3 days. In the end, Oliver concluded that there was no assault and battery or riot. There was all self-defense. The day after the case ended, he resigns from being justice of the peace and moves to Missouri. So that was his first foray with that. Now, I thought when he moves to Missouri, Missouri is going to be a sweet place for him. It's almost like for him coming home a bit. He has married David Whitmer's baby sister. He becomes a Whitmer. He becomes kind of like the general authority in Missouri. David Whitmer is the stake president. And there was when Kirtland fell and the Kirtland train is going to move the body of the church on the Kirtland March, different than Zion's March. We have several marches because we get driven from several places, and we used to call those often marches. So there's the Zion's March, the Kirtland March, marching from Kirtland, also having all the Canadian saints who would have naturally come down to Kirtland are now being bypassed of not going into Kirtland, like John Taylor had actually bought a farm in Kirtland in anticipation of moving down with the Canadian saints to Kirtland. He's told he's been made a member of the Quorum of the 12, but he said he hasn't been sustained yet, and he said, do not come to Kirtland, go directly to far western Missouri. So everyone's converging into Missouri. It becomes a very, very difficult political unrest. As we know, we're going to have the Missouri War as a consequence. But one of the things that's going to happen is there's going to have these two leaderships are going to now collide. Today, President Clark would have no question that his authority is trumped by the authority of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. Would you say that would be relatively clear in your mind, President Clark? Because if not, we should talk. But in those days, it wasn't nearly as clear. And it's not because it's not an unclear issue, because we always understood that the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency were to have jurisdiction over all unorganized areas of the church throughout the world. So we'd call them having general jurisdiction. However, a stake president and a high council have authority over an organized portion of the church, and would call that, you would have what we might refer to as specific jurisdiction. Now, the question would be, because it had never been tested before, whether your specific jurisdiction has greater authority than general jurisdiction. Well, clearly, you know who won that issue. But you can imagine those that were running Missouri and were being asked to now have all these saints come into their community and to be asked to start caring for them all and to managing them all and find property for them all and the whole complexity of it all. It's very tough to say, I want you to be in charge of that, but let me be clear, when we get there, you won't be in charge of anything. And so by April, when Joseph arrives, most of the major excommunications occur. And it's a relatively massive purging, a tragic purging. One of the tragic purgings of the church. We lost some of the great founding leaders, who most of whom never returned. To understand exactly how devastating that would have been. You know, I'll tell you exactly how devastating it is. When Joseph finds himself in Liberty Jail, he gets what we call the Liberty sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, right? Sections 121 to 123. The most famous one is 121, right? But wouldn't you like that to have been a little more attacking the Missourians? Where section 121 is totally introspective. Worry about your own house. Worry about who you are, how you treat people. When you have authority, how do you use that authority? How do you govern? And if you don't fix that, if you don't clean in-house, how are we ever going to take you to the world? And indeed, that is what happened. The purging happened inside the church too. See, the us and thems still exists in the church. That issue of where 121 comes into play still happens in the church today. The very nature of human nature still, and is what Joseph had to deal with when he came. Well, Oliver was one of those casualties. He left with the rest of the Whitmers. A little bit different than the Whitmers, though. He made the decision, rather than become a witness against the church that would result in the Liberty incarcerations and the incarcerations in Richmond jail with Parley P. Pratt and the boys with the Battle of Crooked River. Oliver decided to leave, and he decided to move back home to Kirtland. It's where his family still lived. His brothers and his brother Lyman had said to him, come back and become a lawyer. Matter of fact, if you would have stayed, you would have been a lawyer already. I got sworn into the bar last year. You and I could start practicing law together. Come back home. And Oliver had already shown a predilection to wanting to do that. And so he and his wife traveled back home and traveled to Kirtland. And there he studied law with a guy named Benjamin Bissell, a very well-known lawyer in Geauga County. The church had hired him for about 16 lawsuits to represent the church's interests, though Oliver would have known him well. He read law with them, and then he passed the bar and became admitted to the bar in Ohio. And he and Lyman actually practiced law together in Tiffin. Matter of fact, some would even say there's even the hint that he might have even had an office in the Kirtland Temple at one point, which was used as a school at the time. Matter of fact, we found their advertisements. Cowdery and Cowdery, brothers in law, which I always thought was very clever. Well, Oliver had the political bug, and so he was out campaigning for the Democrats, and he got down to Tiffin, and he was campaigning for the Democrats in Tiffin, and they said, hey, why don't you move down here and open up a newspaper? We hear you're a newspaper man. And so Oliver said, okay, maybe I'll move down with my family. We'll move down to Tiffin, Seneca County, and you can see where that is from Kirtland, and we will enjoy that experience. Well, by the time he gets down there, thinking he has a set-up job to become a newspaper man, word has leaked out that this is the same Oliver Cowdery of the Mormons, and the job evaporated. And so rather than being a newspaper man, he decided he would open up a law practice. And he practiced law there for about 10 years. And in 2006, when we were looking at what we're going to do for this symposium, and I was talking with Richard Anderson about it, I said, Richard, tell me about what your work in Tiffin has been. He says, well, I've been there during the 60s. I was like, wow, you are old. But he said, but I said, did you find law practice? And he said, I found some stuff, but Jeff, I just got to be honest with you. In the ensuing 40, 50 years, most of all those repositories have been raided. And mostly Mormon documents are going to all be gone. I mean, if you can find something, you'd be lucky. But I said, well, I got to go take a look. So I went over to Tiffin. And this is what I found. This is a courthouse that was built in 1880. It was closed. They were getting ready to tear it down because I guess it's full of asbestos. And they were going to build a new courthouse for them. But some citizen groups of the Seneca County have gotten together, have filed a lawsuit to try to preserve it as a historical building. And so it was just closed. So I got down, there's a Heidelberg College there. I talked to them. I said, can anyone get me in there? Is there anything down in the basement? I'm looking for safes. I'm looking for where there would be repositories, where they would archive anything. They said, well, I think there's some things down there, and but you're there at your own risk. And so we went in. And you can see we were told not to go in, and we did. And we found these boxes. Now, these boxes are I know you guys aren't going to think of them as cool as I think they are, but try. Because this is one of the greatest days of my whole life. And not the same as like the day I got married or when my kids were born or my grandkids. I know that because my wife keeps correcting me when I've said that before. She said, I'm just trying to gauge where I fit. This is before she bought me that note. See, in the old days, if you had pleadings, they would trifold them into 3 parts, and then they would stack them in just the narrows, and then they'd write on that spine the case name, the date, what it was about. And then if there was multiple pages, they would tie a ribbon around because they didn't have staplers in those days. Now, in all of the Joseph Smith papers, and I've been in charge of all of the legal papers for early restorational work for the last 15 plus years, I've seen all of it. We have one case that we actually have the pleadings from. Because really what happens is that a clerk of the court would copy in excerpts from the pleadings, from these handwritten pleadings, and then those be in big, heavy, big, fancy books. Leather-bound books that they kept in the day. And no one throws those out. So almost all the information we have, we glean from those books. Docket books, minute books, judgment books, execution books. Those are the big books that we have. But the hand filings, the actual original filings, we have one case. I bought it at an auction. Do you remember when I went to that auction in New York City? It was the first time since Hoffman, the church is officially, Rick Turley went with me because he wanted to go because it was going to be cool. And it was like a Christie's auction. And we knew that there was a bunch of Mormon stuff coming up. And the Mormons, after Hoffman, we just veered from that path. But to have an archive be alive, you have to buy. You have to trade. You have to be in the game. You have to give things to Yale. You have to get things from Yale. You have to go to Claremont. I mean, you have to play the game. And I knew there was one case. I don't know if I should tell you this, but I'm sure it's not being recorded or anything. We paid $87,000 for that one case, 9 pleadings. Now, it did have an affidavit from Emma Smith, and that's extraordinarily rare. Now, of course, she was a school teacher. She was a smart cookie. And so she had a beautiful pen too. But so few, we have so little. And all of a sudden, whoa. In a panic, I called Salt Lake, talked to Ron Esplin, and said, I don't know what to do. I'm here in this basement. I'm finding all this stuff, but I don't know how to open anything up because they're all tied with ribbons. He says, well, what do you think you want to do? I said, I think I got to cut the ribbons. He says, cut them. So I started opening them up. And these were my days never to be forgotten. Standing over the hand of Oliver Cowdery because I could pick out his handwriting just like that. I didn't know what to do with the ribbons. They're either yellow or blue. So I kept every ribbon that I knew that Oliver had tied, right? That he had touched. And I gave them away to missionaries going on their missions as an extra ribbon for their Book of Mormon to say, now you have a ribbon to mark from the guy who scribed this book. Well, we ended up, I was panicked. I came back twice more. I didn't know what to do. I could have stolen it all, but then, you go to hell, and that's bad. But I would have had them because no one cared. I mean, no one was watching us. I could have backed up a U-Haul and unloaded and dragged the whole safe out, and no one would have cared. But I didn't. I just got double-sided color scanners, and I started scanning. And we ended up the first round, we scanned 2,300 pages. I got greedy after a while. I wanted to scan everybody's everything because I want to now see how was the full practice of all the lawyers in Seneca County, not just Oliver. And that was pretty amazing. You can see the handwriting. Here's one of the main lawyers, Abel Ralston. He's one of the lawyers. He was the oldest lawyer. He had a stubby leg, which I don't mind because I have one. But he was famous for it, and I'm not very famous for anything. But he you can tell his handwriting looks like President Clark's. No, I'm just playing. I'm sure his is beautiful. And then you get to compare it with Oliver's handwriting. It became obvious of when you had all. Now, he had a partner most of the time named Joel Wilson. That's who he practiced law with for those 10 years. He lost 4 of his children. All 4 of his children that were born in Tiffin died in Tiffin and are buried in the cemetery there. I spent a couple hours cleaning those graves. It's amazing how things don't get tended like they should be. And I thought he and his sweetheart would like that we knew those sorrows that they had. We found newspaper clippings. Interesting, they had different names for their law firms. They had Cowdery and Wilson. And for us, in law firms today, the name is the name. But depending in these cases, whoever was the lead lawyer usually put their name first. And then they had a guy named C, who I'm just going to tell just for a quick thing. These are the 2 other main lawyers. Abel Ralston, he was the oldest guy with the stubby leg. He loved to argue in court. He was a great court arguer. He didn't like to write briefs, so he started having this guy Robert Peniston, who read the law with Ralston, started writing all of his briefs with him. When Ralston would get too full of students who would read the law, he would send them to Oliver. Oliver has a whole host of lawyers that read the law with Oliver while he lived in Tiffin. One of the people that practiced law with him was a guy named Sidney Smith. Sidney Smith actually petitioned to have his name changed. He wanted a name. He actually was a booter before he became a lawyer. He made boots. He actually made boots that he supposedly wore that said around the cuff, on the top of his boot that he tucked his pants in, said, Attorney at law. Attorney at law. So he was kind of a billboard. But he decided that the Smith was just too common. And so he petitioned. I read his petition. It was like 22 pages long to the Ohio Supreme Court to have his name officially changed. In part, it said, during the age of creation, after a long day, God looked over a mass of humanity and said, I'm going to call all these people Smiths. He says, now it's time for me to emerge out of the obscurity of the Smiths, and I will forevermore now be named C. He was a military guy. They say he was the bravest guy unless he was ever confronted, but he wore his uniform around a lot like they did in those days. One case I'm going to tell you about, C gets retained to represent on a probate case down in the South in someplace, Tennessee or someplace, and he's gone for months. Gets hired by the carpenter to represent on a settling estate of one of his family members. He comes home months later with a new horse, a new suit, a new bridle, a new blanket, a new saddle, and no money. And he said, I have to tell you the bad news, Mr. Carpenter, there was no money. Carpenter decides that that's not true, and he sues him for malpractice. And he wins. C is so incensed that he lost that he appeals, that he refuses to post a bond on his appeal to stay collections, and the only other way, because he's indigent, is for him to be in jail. And so now C's sitting in jail waiting on his appeal, okay? The fellow members of the bar decide we're going to protect him, and they petition for a writ of habeas corpus to get him out of jail. Now, the only reason why this story makes any interest to any of us is who do you think they hired to write the briefs? Peniston, Ralston's lackey. Who do you think they hire him to argue the case? Cowdery. Probably the most famous student that Cowdery had was a guy named William Lang, who ends up being a judge and on the Illinois Supreme Court. Ohio Supreme Court eventually, and he writes a history of Seneca County, and in part he writes about this event. Messrs. R.G. Pendleton and Oliver Cowdery, as the attorneys of General C, applied to Judge Reuben Wood of the Supreme Court for a writ of habeas corpus to get the general out of jail. The writ was issued, and Judge Wood came from Cleveland to Tiffin to hear the case on the 5th of February 1847. General C was discharged. The courthouse was crowded to overflowing during the trial, and on the following night, the brass band with a large crowd of citizens gave General C a serenade. So apparently he was a pretty good lawyer too. In the end, William Lang makes the following observation about our friend Oliver. It's interesting because this is someone outside the church looking in on this person. And for most of us, in the profession, I could only hope that someday when I'm gone or someone's trying to remember me, that they might have something nice to say about what sort of lawyer I was, though I'm not completely sure of it. But this is what William Lang said about his friend Oliver. Mr. Cowdery was an able lawyer and a great advocate. His manners were easy and gentlemanly. He was polite, dignified, yet courteous. He had an open countenance, high forehead, dark brown eyes, Roman nose, clenched lips, and prominent lower jaw. He shaved smooth and was neat and clean in his person. He was of light stature, about 5 feet 5 inches high, and had a loose, easy walk. With all of his kind and friendly disposition, there was a certain degree of sadness that seemed to pervade his whole being. His addresses to the court and jury were characterized by a high order of oratory with brilliant and forensic force. He was modest and reserved, never spoke ill of anyone, never complained. What a tribute to a man. Well, as we know, he spent a decade. Interesting enough, he only spent a decade in the church to begin with, about from 1829 to 1838. That one decade was the place he sat, and then he spent the next decade out. As a witness, though, maybe he had the greatest. You know, it was concerning. For him to come back was going to be tricky. See, that's what was hard. He wanted to come back for ages. He had indicated to Phineas, talk with the boys, help them. He offered to come to Nauvoo multiple times. But certainly after the death of Joseph, there was a crisis of leadership. Brigham Young was holding on to the tether. The last thing he needed was the second elder to come back. What position would he assume? What responsibilities would he think he was entitled to? How would that throw more problems in already a fractured succession? And so Phineas finally had to report to Oliver that I'm just not getting anywhere with Brigham. Oliver said, I have to come back my way if I'm to be a credible witness. If I was excommunicated for being an untrustworthy person, then what good is my witness about the restoration? If the very people that I was restoring the church for did not trust me. So I need to have them reverse the basis of my leaving so that my witness can be sure. And that was too much for Brigham, and I've studied him in the last several years in a considerable extent, because if you don't understand Brigham, you don't understand the church. Just like if you don't understand Joseph, you don't understand the church. And Brigham was an amazingly forgiving man. Generous and kind and sweet disposition. But if you crossed Joseph, it was going to be very difficult for him to ever let that go. And so Phineas said, I don't know what to do. I'm going to look to get more help. I'm going to have Orson Hyde help me. He's in the quorum. I think he can maybe get it there. And sure enough, Orson Hyde negotiates him coming back. By this time, Oliver's sick. He has tuberculosis. And he travels to Council Bluffs to meet with the leadership of the church. They ask him, what are you looking for? And he says, I am looking for no position. I am looking just to be amongst the saints again. He says, I know the gate. And I know the way. And I know that Orson Hyde has the authority to bring me through. For I gave it to him. And remember, the 3 witnesses appointed the first quorum of the 12, in which Orson Hyde was one. He knew. And so, of course, they brought him back. Now, bringing him back was one step. Getting him to Utah would be a trickier one, because everyone was poor. Everyone had to finance their own way west. So you took the time you needed. So he moved on to Richmond. He went to his brother-in-law's place, David Whitmer, where he moved in. I think in part from my readings that he was hopeful that he could bring David West with him. But you know, he took sick there. There's a couple people came to visit him. In July of 27th, he would write in his own journal, I will only say that when the time comes, I am ready. But I'm not persuaded that it has yet fully come. Yet the Lord vindicate our characters and cause our testimony to shine, and then will man be saved in his kingdom. Others came to visit him, and Reuben Miller would write in his journal, quoting Oliver, just a handful of months before his death. I wrote with my own pen the entire Book of Mormon, save a few pages, as it fell from the lips of the prophet. I beheld with my eyes and handled with my hands the gold plates from which it was translated. I also beheld the interpreters. The priesthood is here. I was present when with Joseph when an holy angel from God came down from heaven and conferred or restored the Aaronic priesthood. I was also present with Joseph when the Melchizedek priesthood was conferred by the holy angels of God. And then finally, to Samuel Richards, one of his last visitors, accept assurances, dear brother, of the unfeigned prayer of him who, in connection with Joseph the seer, was blessed with all above ministrations, and who earnestly and devoutly hopes to meet you in the celestial glory. He would pass away in David Whitmer's home. His last word, just like sweet Emma's last word, Joseph. Now, it's not how you start life. It's how you end your life. They built this memorial for him, dedicated in 1911. A few of us have seen it. Most of us don't go down to Richmond to visit it down there. When you do, you must. I think all of us have our own tests, my friends, and Oliver had his. But I do believe in my heart that in some distant future, when you or I may be at a council, at a conference up in heaven, and the door's open, of course, I'll be sitting toward the back where I belong. And Oliver will walk in. And we'll all stand up. And we'll watch him walk to the front and onto the stage to take his rightful place amongst the great ones. Those that were there at the beginning, that in their poverty and uncertainty and confusion and difficulty of the restoration. We are in the midst of it. What a sweet prophet to have today that would tell us that we are in the midst of a restoration, and that's why we must continue to rely on revelation. Oliver knew that process. I bear you testimony that as we learn about these men and these women, the heroines and heroes of the restoration, that our testimonies are fortified. That when we need to follow a prophet, we can look at the examples of those that followed so faithfully. And we can then realize it is always time to follow. There's always redemption in the Lord's kingdom. That is the process of the restoration that we know with surety because of revelation. I bear testimony that at some point in time, maybe he will send me a note somewhere and tell me I didn't screw him up too much. Because I do value him as my friend. I spent many nights transcribing his documents, those 2,300 pages. And every now and then I'll talk to him. And I'll say, well done, Oliver. You were a smart cookie, you were. No wonder the Lord picked you to be one of our founders. I pray that we all might be founders in our own homes, in which we do have both general and specific jurisdiction. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Our dear Father in heaven, we're so grateful for the opportunity we've had today to hear from wonderful Brother Walker about Oliver Cowdery, faithful founder of the church in these latter days. We're grateful to know more of his personality and more of his character, and why thou chose him to help in the restoration of the church. We're grateful for the strength that gives our testimonies. We're so grateful for the Spirit that's been here this day and the testimony that we've had of the truthfulness of what we've heard. And bless us to be able to keep these things in our hearts and relay them to our families and keep us safe. And these things we pray for in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
As we said at the start, anybody that needs to leave is excused. You don't need to stay. But I just want to take a minute and thank Brother Walker for his preparation and his sharing with us so many of these interesting things. We're going to invite him to come to the podium now, and let's take 10 minutes or so if you have questions. Jeff, do you want to come up here? And I'll try and help cut this off in about 10 minutes.
Okay. If there's any, I'm sure I covered everything, so, but happy to answer. Yes, sir.
Oliver's education in Protestant, did that come from Vermont?
Yeah. Martha's father, he was not really engaged in it.
Say the question again so everybody.
There's a question about him as a rodsman, which was a practice that they had, and and there was some critique about whether that would lend to why he was involved in the Book of Mormon in the first place. And but that we've really traced down. Matter of fact, Richard Anderson really did a great piece on that. And it really traces it back down to his father and his father being estranged from the local congregation because of it. That Oliver's was really too young. You got to remember, you think about Warren being 18 years older than him, one of his brothers. So, the family was around in that area in Vermont for quite a long time. Does that help you there? And I could point to an article that Richard wrote relatively recently before his passing on it. We are trying to push Richard to get some of his materials out, because I had an interest of doing everything I could to help him get his stuff done. And I didn't need credit for what he was doing. And so that was one of the pieces that we were working on. And so I believe it got published, but if not, you just reach out to me, because I have a copy of an article that he had been working on. During the end of his life, he started looking at a retrospective of his ancestry, Oliver's ancestry, and that was going to kind of be, I didn't know exactly how Richard was going to use it. It was really cool stuff. I just didn't know if it was going backwards rather than forwards of trying to get stuff done. Yes, sir.
Did Oliver Cowdery ever become a Mason?
No.
So Joseph and Hiram were both Masons.
Yes, it was a Nauvoo experience, and he was never in the Nauvoo period. So the Masonic Movement was a movement that happened in 42, starting into 42, and Oliver had been gone from the Saints until, 47, really 48 when he came back. Yeah.
Do you know when the temple work was done for Oliver Cowdery's family?
I don't. Pretty tragic, though, not having actual descendants of him, isn't it? I mean, it's such a huge loss, which, you could see just how much pain that family had gone through, and anyone who's ever lost a child, to think you could lose 5 of your 6 children. No wonder William Lang would say he was melancholy. There's a lot of reasons. Matter of fact, I will tell you, it's interesting. I actually know the case he was working on. He was writing a appellate brief the day he learned that Joseph had been murdered. And that he said he left the office. Joel Wilson says he left the office for the day to go home when word came that he was devastated by it. Yes.
There are things that strike me somewhat humorous, and I'm thinking of the baptism. And I didn't know Oliver was so short and so light. And then you think of Joseph. So Joseph baptizing Oliver, no problem. Oliver baptizing Joseph.
Yeah, maybe a double dipper.
Yeah, and I can see Joseph in his humor laughing about it somewhat. Now, you portrayed Oliver to me here today absolutely wonderfully. I see him very serious. And I see Joseph laughing, because if not, he'd be crying at tragedy so much. But the good news. What was their personal relationship? Was it more like business partners, or were they close friends?
And I don't know all the answers to it. From my readings, I would tell you that I think they were as intimate as friends as brothers are. And if you remember, well, you probably don't remember. It'd be like a double jeopardy question, and if you got it right, I'd be stunned, but I'd be so proud of you. Every time I get one right with my wife, because she's so much better at it than I am. But Hiram took Oliver's place in the first presidency. That was part of the issue. See, Oliver did not know he had been replaced when he wrote a letter to David Whitmer, and they were talking about if they came back, what would it mean? And these were just two old war horses talking about coming back. They had different agendas. Oliver's, I think, was sincere. How would this work? David Whitmer publishes the letter that says, I still have the keys. When they question him in Council Bluff, they ask him about the letter, saying, do you still think you have the keys, Oliver? And Oliver is very quick to reply, no. When I wrote the letter, I was unaware that Hiram had been called to replace me. I would have no keys, of course. And so David Whitmer kind of burned him a little bit there, but of course Oliver was smart enough to know exactly. But that was a concern they had. But you think about it, who would Joseph pick to replace Oliver? Who could replace Oliver? There was only one person in, I think, Joseph's mind, and that'd be his brother. And that may indicate somewhat how Joseph saw where Oliver fit. Yeah.
Hey, Jeff, what do you have to say about the lectures on faith? Because I know that Oliver gets some have said that he wrote those.
Yeah, I think.
The church doesn't use them.
No, I think we have articles of the lectures on faith. We call them manuals today. I mean, we have correlation. It was the predecessor to church manuals. And that's why we know we have the Doctrine and Covenants, the doctrine being what was the lectures on faith, and the covenants being the revelations. The covenants, revelations are the same term in their minds. I think probably Sidney Rigdon wrote more of those than Cowdery. And I think that's really, he came into the play as kind of the theologian. I don't think Cowdery claimed to have been a theologian like Rigdon was, being a former Campbellite. And so I think those are more the of Sidney Rigdon's product. I still find them wonderful. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with them. It's just we don't have one size fits all in the church anymore. And so we have different manuals that fits different ages and different purposes. And that's really why we've now I think that's the general reason why it was decided to discontinue the use of them. Yeah, right over here first. Yes. Yep. Yep. I think it was at least a decade. I think she moved down to her daughter's place in Richmond. No. Yes, sister. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go here real quickly. I'm just looking at who was first, and I don't know if anything's fair, but.
So you said Oliver was born in 1806?
Yes.
And he died
1850.
1850. So he was only 44?
Yes. See, it's always amazing how young these boys are. Mostly as we get older. Because I don't feel old, but I would have been like an old man.
So, other than Joseph Smith, who do you think were Oliver's closest friends or confidants in the church? I get the impression he was close with Orson Hyde.
Yes. Pratt boys. I think the easier answer would be, who do you think he was crosswise with? Because that's probably a kinder way. I think he was crosswise with Sidney. I think Sidney wanted Joseph's favor. I don't have anything against Sidney too, to be honest. I mean, Sidney, after the beating that Sidney Rigdon took on the Hiram farm, that he never recovered from, that he likely had epilepsy as a consequence or some sort of brain injury, and it changed him. If you remember, right toward the end, Sidney was living inland from Nauvoo. He was fearful of the diseases on the river, and so Joseph says, "I think it's time we replace him from the first presidency." And Hiram advised him. He says, "But Joseph, Sidney earned his right," referring to the beating he took for the cause. And so sweet Hiram talked Joseph out of it. In some ways, he wished he would have not talked him out of it, because he caused a bunch of havoc once the two of them were murdered.
So, in your mind, when Oliver died, was he on good terms with Martin Harris and David Whitman?
Well, I think Martin was a whole different commodity. Now, I'm glad Martin came back, but Martin had a much more sordid, contentious relationship. He went with the Strangites for a while, and he actually went on a mission to England. I mean, he just did things. I think the Whitmers, David Whitmer, I don't want to get too afield on it, but my wife, I should praise her because she deserves it first. But also, about 7, 8, I started having one of my daughters transcribed all of her papers for me. I needed someone to help me do transcription work. There's just so much of it. And so once my daughter started doing it, then one of my daughter-in-law started doing it, then another daughter-in-law started doing it. We called it the sorority, and they were all doing transcription work. And my wife would say, "That's fine. You've got the whole family doing this now. That's your thing. It's not my thing." And I was like, okay. But about 7, 8 years ago, she came to me and said, "What do you think about me learning how to do some transcription work?" I was like, "Babe, I don't want to, force you into something." But she's so smart and she's so good at it. But she was doing some early transcription work for us for the Joe Smith papers, because we started using all my ladies to do transcription. And it worked great, because then they could be home with their babies, and they could, if they had to put their kids down, they could just, it would work for them. And she said to me early on, she's doing some early transcription work, she goes, "Boy, those Whitmers are going to be problems." I'm like, "What? How do you know that?" "Yes, they will, but wow." She goes, "So much ego. You see so much ego right in their early writings." I'm like, the one thing I learned, I used to sit downtown all the time, we need more women historians. There's too many pudgy, white, middle-aged men looking at this stuff. Women look at it differently. They see things better. They see things in a different perspective. It's so much more useful than just having a bunch of us talk amongst ourselves and we all agree with each other. And she got it right. There was a lot of ego with the Whitmers. Now, they were a royal family too of the Restoration. I mean, you kind of have the Knight family, they're royalty. You have the Smith family, of course, the first family. You have the Knight family, the second family, the Whitmers, maybe a third tier royalty. These were true, great, wholesale families engaged in a church that's going to be known for families. But there's a lot of ego. And let's be honest, friends, I bet there's egos in this congregation right now. Just ask my wife. A lay ministry breeds it. Passive aggressive and ego. I mean, we just talk nice and then say what we want when we're not around. But you know, a lay ministry, it's a genius. It's a genius of the church. But it's also a challenge. And the Whitmers and these early saints are trying to sort that out. What if some of us actually saw the angels? What if you actually saw the plates? Do you think you might have a claim a little above someone else in gospel doctrine class? You know? He saw the plates. He saw the urim and thummim. He saw the breastplate. He saw the angel. That would probably mess with me a little bit, you know? And so I have empathy because I think there's reality in it that we see already. You know, you just got to listen to the returned mission president when he comes back, and he knows more than most of us, and he might. So I give everyone space.
Let's do a couple more questions.
Okay? Yeah. Oh, right here. I'm sorry.
So when Oliver was denied the opportunity to come back to the church during the non-boom era, and at that time,
Well, denied. See, Oliver had.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah.
Repeat the question.
Oh, she's saying.
okay, well, my point being is that so he was kind of steered in a way to not come back in that time, but in that process is when the Cowdery Temple was up and running and temple covenants were being administered. And so essentially he wasn't able to receive his
Correct.
and he was baptized in house of blood. So he essentially died without that.
Correct.
So
Repeat the question.
what was his?
And say, I don't know. I can't imagine it not all being done twice or more, because we used to do them a lot of times. But the question is, do we know when? I want to make a clarification. The question was, do we have a clear understanding of when he would have received all of his endowed blessings from the temple? And it would have been quite a while into the temple process, because we didn't do proxy work for quite a long time in the temple. That was a maturation of the temple process. But I think, to make sure that we're clear, I don't think anyone told Oliver, you can't come back to the church. I think what Oliver was saying, for me to come back, there are certain things the church has to do. Because I was excommunicated for not being a faithful person, for not being a trustworthy person. Oliver would say those were all false allegations. During his court hearing, he did not appear. He sent a letter. He made the argument in his letter, first, is that the disciplinary council, which was being held by a high council, lacked jurisdiction to rule on his case. Because as a member of the First Presidency, doctrinally, only the Quorum of the 12 could hold a disciplinary council on a member of the First Presidency. He was probably technically correct in his reading of the doctrine. The only problem with his position was that Joseph Smith was at the disciplinary council, and so he could have suspended any rule and made any new rule he wanted to, And so saying he didn't stop the proceedings, by effect, he approved that the process was acceptable. Okay? His argument centered in his letter to the church was, he says, I have no conflict with the doctrines of the church. My objection is with the outward government of the church. Meaning, if you read between the lines, personalities. That he lost faith in the leadership taking over Missouri. I think just as one other comment on that, I mentioned it to the president so he can tug at me when I should stop. One of the main arguments of all of the ones that were purged in spring of 38 was this concept that you do not have the right to tell me temporally how to run my life. They use the phrase, we are sons of the revolution. Or they use the phrase, we are sons of 76. In his letter, he wrote, my family arrived at Plymouth Rock. I'm uncomfortable with the extent the church wants to take control of my temporal life. And the reason why that was in conflict, and it still remains in conflict today, ironically, in the church today, is that Protestantism essentially is a Sunday religion. You have church on Sunday, and then you have 6 days to live your life. And then you go back to church on Sunday, and then you have 6 more days to live your life. And it's kind of that pattern. Joseph would argue, I'm creating a city of Enoch. I'm creating like the children of Israel, like with Moses, one that has all parts of our world are integrated. This was completely a new way to approach religion. And for many of us today, it still is complicated for us. I mean, you think about just the effects of the pandemic. We have a prophet who has given instructions. Some embrace it easily, and some have a much more difficult time with it. To say, why should someone be telling me I should be able to, I'm a son of liberty. And so that was a central component with most of all of those excommunications that were happening in the spring. That was a common theme. They had just lost Jackson. Remember, Jackson County had been lost, and most of these saints who were now up in Caldwell County owned property in Jackson County. And they desperately wanted to sell their property to buy property in Caldwell. And they would say to Joseph, can we sell? And Joseph said, the Lord has not given me permission to let you sell your property yet. And it's out, as soon as I get word, I don't have word one way or another, but until we get word, no one's allowed to sell. Well, that'd be a pretty hard swallow. And so that's why this became a much more complicated political environment that they were in too, not just, like Oliver would say, it was about the outward government. How do you run it? How much control do we let our church leaders have over us? That's tricky. And I don't think most people would say it's not been put to rest. That dynamic is still part of the fabric of the city of Enoch and the children of Israel who wandered around for 40 years waiting to figure that out. And here we are, a church still trying to sort out exactly how much do we embrace that? And how should we find that to just rub us? I find it, as you might guess, makes my life easier.
But even given that, which is very important, it just hurts my heart that he was in those recent blessings at that time before he passed away.
Of course.
And waited and had to wait.
But always remember, the easiest way that when I would think about waiting and how hard it is, luckily we got the pretty great price to understand that one day to God is 1,000 years to man. So our waits are all pretty short. If you live to be 100, you know what you've lived in God's mind, most of a morning. And so all of it happens pretty quick when it all gets done. The most important thing that will happen is that it all gets done. And that's why I really believe in my mind's eye that when, in the end, he will sit on the stand with the great ones, and everyone will know the Oliver that Joseph trusted and that the Lord trusted. Maybe one more?
Tyler had a question.
You just answered it for the most part. I was just kind of curious. I didn't want to belabor the excommunication, but just what events led up to that had to do with the failure of the Kirtland Safety Society or
I touched on the high ones. The only ones that I hadn't mentioned on, 2 counts for practice for the intent to practice law. 2 charges raised against him for wanting to be a lawyer. Now, if you read into it, I really think they were disgruntled business people that were afraid that he was going to do collections work against them. Because I've tried to trace down who were the ones that were advocating for those charges. There were 9 charges brought against him in his disciplinary council.
So in all your research, do you believe that he should excommunicate then, or do you feel like
He had to. He knew it too. And they had to bring him back. He was the only one that came back fully on his own accord, who never damaged the church while he was gone. Now, I am a Cowdery lover, okay? And someone who wants to tell us about Martin, because I love Martin too. It's just that, Martin did a lot of damage before he came back. But he also financed the Book of Mormon, for heaven's sakes. He was the only man on earth could have done that for us. All right, President.
Did you have a question before?
Yes, sister.
The last one.
Well, and this is not all of a question. This is more of a lawyer's perspective question.
Okay.
I have a question of, when the saints were forced out, many of them tried to sell their land, couldn't, but they were forced off their land. I often wondered about that property, how people were able to go in, take it over, have a clear title.
No clear title. Matter of fact, it'd be interesting that we could chat about it. Especially about Missouri. I've studied Missouri the hardest about the property land rights in Missouri, and I'm convinced that everything had a cloud on it. If there's an extermination order or an order forcing you to leave the state, all actions against you would be stayed until that order was lifted. Now, I believe in a half-full glass like the rest of we all should. But I do know when that the extermination order was rescinded by the governor of Missouri, one of the major groups that were advocating for it was the real estate section of the Missouri Bar. Because I believe they had so many clouds on their title that as soon as it's rescinded, after 7 years, all those claims fell away. Well, that's a happy way to end.
There you go. That's it. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thanks, everybody, all brothers and sisters, and have a good evening.
No, it is an irony, isn't it? Because people have asked me a lot. You could have, my family have a claim. They did until